Welcome to the Peak of Geek, where we've hit the top, but with no plans to stop. The 1980s meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for fans of movies with a more sinister tone, it was the decade of horror. Movies like
The Shining, The Thing, The Fly, Gremlins, An American Werewolf in London, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, Friday the 13th 1-8, and Nightmare on Elm Street 1-5, Poltergeist 1-3, Halloween 2-5, Evil Dead 1 and 2, Sleepaway Camp 1 and 2, Hellraiser 1 and 2, Creepshow 1 and 2, Child's Play 1 and 2, which I go into much more detail in a different video, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, among many, many others.
Anyway, it's no surprise that even hardcore fans of the genre are still discovering hidden gems in between all the hits and misses crowding the decade. One movie in particular, though, that was billed as a comedy horror when it released in 1986, would air on cable TV in the 90s and scare me into literal tears when I watched it completely by accident at 6 years old. Let's knock on the door, slowly open it, and step inside the house.
No, not that super weird but equally awesome Japanese film of the same name that released nearly 10 years earlier. The one we're talking about was American-made and hit theaters in 1986. But before we get right into it, let's talk about the team who created it and their ties to some movies that may not surprise you, but others that absolutely will. To kick things off, House was director Steve Miner's first film since leaving the Friday the 13th franchise, where he acted as associate producer among other roles on the original, and would go on to direct parts 2 and 3.
And if you know your Jason Voorhees history, you know that Part 3 is famous for two things. One, for being in 3D, and two, for debuting Jason in his iconic hockey mask, after he wore a sack on his head in the last movie. Anyway, during production of Part 3, 3D effects supervisor Martin J. Sadoff, an avid hockey fan, happened to have some gear on set and used the hockey mask for a lighting test. Director Steve Miner loved it. This is horror history in the making, folks.
Another connection to Friday the 13th is Camp Crystal Lake's co-creator, Sean S. Cunningham, who produced and directed the first Friday, then acted as producer on House. My favorite fact about Cunningham is that when he took out that iconic advertisement in Variety magazine to tout his upcoming project as the most terrifying film ever made, he didn't actually have a finished script yet. Bold claims.
The last overt tie to Friday the 13th is with House's score, which was composed by the legendary Harry Manfredini, who gave us the unforgettable Friday the 13th theme and the chanting of which can still run a chill down my spine.
While on the writing side of things, the story of House originally came from Fred Dekker as an anthology script inspired by The Twilight Zone. Dekker's name might ring a bell if you watched his films Night of the Creeps, a cult film that's the perfect homage to the B-movies of the 1950s, or The Monster Squad, a personal favorite that feels like The Goonies mashed up with the Universal monsters.
While Dekker provided the story idea for House, it was Ethan Wiley who rewrote the screenplay to make it a feature-length film and add in the comedic moments.
Wiley would go on to write and direct a sequel to House a year later. But before he moved into writing and directing, he actually got his start as a special effects artist and puppeteer on Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, and Gremlins, that zany Christmas classic.
In other words, House had a lot of credible star power behind it. And when it hit theaters in February of 1986, it took second place in the box office that opening weekend, only losing out to the John Hughes Brat Pack classic Pretty in Pink. So while I would never say this film is a failure, especially since it would end up creating a franchise with 3 other installments, I would say that it has become quite forgotten over the years.
House follows a horror author named Roger Cobb, who's having a rough go. He's separated from his wife, their only son mysteriously disappeared, and his aunt recently committed suicide. He wants to write a new book about his experiences in the Vietnam War in order to settle his personal demons, and decides that moving into his dead aunt's house is the perfect place to conquer his writer's block. While settling in, Roger starts having intense nightmares, and soon discovers that the house is very, very haunted.
And don't forget, this movie is supposed to be a horror comedy. I find that's a hard hybrid genre to get just right. In most cases, the finished project is either a funny film with out-of-place frights, or a scary one with awkward laughs, but rarely does it mix in a way that feels completely satisfying.
As if in an effort to tip the odds more so into comedy, The filmmakers cast William Katt, mostly known during this time period for the superhero comedy series The Greatest American Hero, as the lead character Roger Cobb, and George Wendt, of Cheers fame, as the funny, nosy neighbor. Despite these casting choices, I would argue that this movie is a lot scarier than it is funny, especially to an unsuspecting child.
I first watched House on cable TV in the early 90s. It was around Halloween, and I was 6 years old.
While scanning the TV guide, I saw that there was a movie called Double Double Toil and Trouble, starring Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen. Like many kids at the time, I was a Full House fan, and this sounded like the perfect spooky evening movie to watch with my dad.
We tuned into the channel listed in the TV guide and got ready to see what crazy adventures the Olsen twins would get up to this time. But as the movie began, and we sat back to watch with our popcorn bowls in hand, I immediately started to think, where were Mary-Kate and Ashley?
Early into the movie, I remember a scene where a small boy was playing outside with his toys when suddenly, out of nowhere, a decayed-looking hand pops out of the grass.
Whoa, what? I remember thinking in my young, naive brain, that's just the Olsen twins playing tricks on that boy. It was a little scary, but I'm brave. I mean, I'm almost as old as the Olsen twins. So I kept watching the movie. Things kept progressing little by little until a certain something happened that made me jump behind the couch and cry in sheer terror. I remember looking at my dad and saying, "Why are the Olsen twins letting this happen?" During this particular scene, Roger Cobb's separated wife has seemingly come to check on him, and then this happens.
What are you doing with that gun?
Nothing. Sandy.
In my young and frightened mind, this purple hag-like creature looked like Chucky, the killer doll who would constantly invade my nightmares.
When the hag appears again a bit later, she speaks in a sped-up, high-pitched voice that sounds very familiar if you watched or listened to Alvin and the Chipmunks. But this time, they weren't annoying Dave or singing Christmas songs.
But even watching these hag scenes today, there's a brief moment where I'm a scared 6-year-old boy hiding behind the couch and wondering when the Olsen twins were just going to reveal themselves and save the day.
In every Full House episode, whenever there was a problem, the family would always come together, Uncle Jesse would probably tell someone to have mercy, and everything would be fine. Usually in 20 minutes or less. And then the credits would roll after a nice, warm hug.
It was probably at this point when my dad decided to check a different channel, and sure enough,
we caught the very end of the Olsen twins' adventures, with the twins looking innocent in their little witches' hats.
The TV guide had gotten it wrong and mixed up the channels. I had no idea what movie I watched by accident, but at that point, it didn't really matter. The damage was already done.
Everywhere you look, everywhere in this there's a hag and a hand to surprise you.
This mystery movie would terrify me for years, until one day I randomly remembered it and decided I had to know what it was. I found a website where you could type in the description of a movie or a TV show that you couldn't remember the title of, and people would help. Somehow, based on my lackluster description of boy sees hand pop out of ground and beautiful woman bends over and turns into scary monster, someone told me it was the movie House. Wait, what? This is a horror comedy? What part of this is supposed to be funny? These days when I watch House, I have to admit, I do enjoy it. I mean, I picked up the special edition release from Arrow Video, and I still watch it every once in a while. It's got its problems, sure, but I would argue that it works way more often than it doesn't.
There's an effective, creepy mood all throughout, and some comedic moments that will occasionally make me chuckle, especially when George Wendt is on screen. I would say, if you're a fan of haunted house movies or impressive and detailed practical creature effects, check this one out. I would even go so far as to say it's better than Pretty in Pink.
But what about you? Are there any movies that you watched way too young that maybe traumatized you? Anything you might recommend? Let me know down in the comments below. And until next time, I hope you don't see this thing in your nightmares.